This is the second oral history with Tom Rauch. We did another oral history on June 18th, 1998 for the Carnegie Library Oral History Project. And this is another one that is for the Carnegie Library and also for the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum. Tom, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Tom has been very active in working with protesters and education about Rocky Flats. And we're going to just pick up and talk about some of the things that we didn't talk specifically about on the last audio tape. So, Tom, in reviewing what you said before, I wanted to ask you some questions. You talked about one of the first things that you were involved with was the, in about 1974, I believe.
Right.
The Rocky Flats Action Group.
Right.
And can you just kind of start with that, your recollections about that?
Yeah.
What kind of people were involved?
Well, as I recall, Dorothy, it was the principal impetus for this group came from the American Friends Service Committee and Pam Solo and Judy Danielson, who were their staff members then. Now, there had been concern about Rocky Flats before this, and there had been occasional small groups of people protesting there, or people expressing in public their concern about environmental issues because of the 1957 and 1969 fires. And Dr. Ed Martell, who was at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, had done some research following the 1969 fire, doing soil samples. But it was, as I recall, in the spring or summer of 1974 that the American Friends Service Committee staff invited interested people to come together and talk about how we might do some concerted, focused work on Rocky Flats, both relating to environmental issues and to the other major issue of what Rocky Flats was doing, producing the nuclear triggers or pits for all of our nuclear warheads. And the groups that came together there were a lot of environmentalists, and as you remember, at that time, environmentalists were a mainstream group in Colorado. It was not just kind of the fringe group. They managed to get the Winter Olympics kept out of Denver and Colorado, but they were a lot of, very thoughtful, intelligent people. There were people who had been active in the Vietnam War, and as you know, those included not only the typical hippie protesters, whom some people think those are the only ones who protested it, but there were a lot of middle-class people, a lot of professional people, people from the faith communities. And we had people who were, in principle, opposed to weaponry and war-making, committed to nonviolence, such as folks from the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers. So it was a wide range of people who came together in those initial meetings.
And I believe you said that your own education had been becoming more knowledgeable about the Vietnam War, and then working for clergy and laity concerned.
Yes.
And then moving from there to the other work. Is that
Right, that's right, Dorothy, and thanks to then I started doing volunteer work with American Friends Service Committee and just became more aware of the larger nuclear weapons issues and nuclear arms race, military spending, all those kinds of things. But my political activism did begin with the Vietnam War. Yeah. So.
And how was that for you to have not been politically active before and then to move into that?
Well, it was exciting in a way. I mean, it was very meaningful to me because when I began to learn and read about the Vietnam War, thanks to one of my students at Regis College, it seemed to me a very important moral and ethical issue that America wasn't facing. We were seeing it as, just turn back the communists, no matter what happened in Vietnam or to the people of Vietnam. And so I had that ethical concern from my previous my previous life as a Jesuit priest and a lifelong Catholic, and then I became more aware of the political realities of our world, and just saw often the disconnect between what we as a principally Christian nation, at least in name and in numbers, were doing in the rest of the world, in the name of our supposed principles, you know. So.
And when you were working with the Rocky Flats Action Group,
Mm-hmm.
I think did that moved into work? You were doing education work as well as protest work?
Yes,
right?
we did. The first year that this group met, we spent a lot of time educating ourselves about issues relating to Rocky Flats. You know, its history and what it was doing then, what we knew about environmental and health issues, what we knew about releases from the 57 and 69 fires and so on.
Was it easy to get information about Rocky Flats?
Well, no, it's very hard to get anything from the department. It was I guess the Energy Research and Development Agency then, but the predecessor of Department of Energy. Obviously very hard to get any information out of them because it was all top secret, classified, and so on. And but people were able to do something by, like Dr. Martell, I said, had students who Dr. Martell had students who gathered soil samples on the eastern side of Rocky Flats because they weren't permitted to go onto the plant site itself. And that's when he discovered, by analyzing those plutonium samples in the soil, particles, that they didn't come from the 1969 fire, but from some leaking oil barrels that were laced with plutonium that had been put out in an open area at the plant. And so the plant finally had to come clean and say, well, yeah, this is what happened there. And so we began to get a bit of information, but it was really like pulling teeth out of an elephant to get any information from them. So, but, you know, there were other sources, I mean, people who were able to do some studies like that. And then there began some people who had worked at Rocky Flats and developed cancers. And so it was either in the late 70s or early 80s that their widows began bringing workers' compensation claims. And so that, through the judicial process, opened up some more information. You know.
So now I think that you did participate in that first big demonstration in 1978.
Yes, I was out there. I wasn't one of the principal organizers by any means, but that again was organized by American Friends Service Committee and others who were part of the Rocky Flats Action Group, and a growing nationwide network of local groups that were also had Department of Energy facilities in their neighborhood. And the Fellowship of Reconciliation partnered with AFSC in doing this project and trying to get people from all over the country. And indeed, people did come to help swell the ranks up to 6,000 people that day out at the, it was the west gate of Rocky Flats. We had the rally.
And can you remember what that was like for you? Was that your first big protest?
It was. We had had one the year before, maybe 150 or 200 people on, I think, Nagasaki Day. But it was just very exhilarating with all those people, and I don't remember the speakers now. I do remember there was a first rally downtown at the Federal Building in the morning, and I'm pretty sure Stokely Carmichael spoke there. But I don't remember other speakers from either of those rallies. But it was very exciting. They had music and, you know, lots of banners and all of those kinds of activities.
And what kinds of people, can you recall, you know, what sorts of people those folks were?
Well, I think it was a real variety. I mean, I think of all ages, you know, I think predominantly white, unfortunately. but there were some people of color, but not a large number. But as I said, quite a few, hundreds at least, came from other cities and other states. There was one group that came from High Point, North Carolina, I think, that had a kind of mock nuclear weapon on the flatbed of a truck. And they drove that all the way and had planned to stop at various communities where they did some educational outreach for that. So they arrived with their nuclear weapon or nuclear missile. I'm not sure which it was. But it was a real mix of ages and, you know, professional people, working people, students. You know.
And were you involved at all? My understanding, and you referred to it before, was that there was some dispute within the protesters as to whether or not they were going to have just a symbolic protest, or then whether they were going to stay.
Yeah, I wasn't in on the kind of the core planning group of the whole event, but as you pointed out, there was an agreement. Some people wanted to block the railroad tracks into Rocky Flats, these were tracks on their property, and they did use railroad cars for bringing in some of the materials, bringing in some of the old warheads, I guess, for recycling and taking out some of the new ones. They also did some by truck, and so they finally worked out an agreement with Rocky Flats people that they could be permitted to be on the tracks as a symbolic protest for 24 hours. There was no train scheduled for that time, so it was no big deal. But then, I don't know, I think it was when the group settled down there, some of them decided they wanted to stay and make it a real protest. And my memory is of hearing that did cause friction between the organizers of the rally and the whole event, who had agreed with Rocky Flats officials that this would be simply a 24-hour symbolic stay. And then the protesters who decided, well, we're really serious about this. We don't want any more plutonium coming into this plant or going out. And so we're going to stay here. And they did. I think they camped out people. I don't think the same people were there for a whole year. Maybe some were. But I believe it was about a year before they were finally removed by law enforcement people.
Now, looking back, it might be surprising that people could actually demonstrate within Rocky Flats.
Yeah.
Do you know how that
Well,
came about?
I do know. It's very interesting. There had been a lot of dissatisfaction with Dow Chemical, who were the original operators of the plant. They started working there in 1952. And with these two major fires that almost breached buildings and would have poured plutonium out into the surrounding communities, and then other complaints, the leaking oil barrels stored out on the open field, that kind of thing. So the government looked for a new contractor, and Rockwell International was hired to begin in 1975. Their general manager whether it was a Rockwell man or a DOE man, Bob Williams was the man in charge there. And he had known Dr. John Cobb, who was then a professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, and had been very involved in getting AFSC to look at Rocky Flats because of some study he had done relating to dead people and plutonium burden in their bodies.
This is Dr. Cobb.
Dr. Cobb. Well, he and Bob Williams knew each other from, I don't know, college days, I guess. I don't know if they kept a close friendship, but they did know each other. And Rockwell came in with the pledge to be more open to the public. So when we planned this 1975 rally, the year before, which was about 150 people or so, Bob Williams gave us permission to come just inside the west gate. As I recall, as you went in the gate to your right, there was a kind of depressed, you went down a little hill and there was an area. And we were allowed to be there. The next year, I think when plans came out, as I recall, Rocky Flats refused to let us be on their property. And so the group went to court, and I think claimed the precedent of the previous year for being allowed into that area. And eventually the court sided with the protesters. But that, at least, is my understanding. Now, you may hear a different version from Pam Solo, who was right in the midst of all the planning. But at least that's my memory. And then the two succeeding years after 78, when we had large rallies there on 79 and 80, were on the north side of the plant, as you probably remember. And that was, again, we were on their property.
Oh, you were inside the gate?
We were inside. There was no gate up there, really. I mean, there was no main entrance, but it was all open space, you know, kind of sloping down towards the plant, but quite some distance from the buildings themselves. That was along Highway 128. So, but I'm pretty sure it was that precedent of the new general manager allowing us on there in 1975 that was the basis for the courts allowing us to have future rallies on the property. So.
Now maybe we could move a little bit to the protest called the encirclement.
Yes.
You were a major figure
Yeah.
in organizing.
Mm.
I believe you said you had just started working for the American Friends Service Committee not too long before this.
Yeah.
Is that?
Well, yeah, yes. Actually, I think during the winter of 82 and 83 and the early part of 83, I was not on the staff yet of AFSC, but there was a small group of people met, mostly AFSC, and then people from Boulder, some of whom became founders of the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center after the encirclement, and met together and were talking about doing some kind of action that summer in concert with peace groups in Western Europe and throughout the United States. And the focus of the protest was the plans of the Reagan administration to put the Pershing missiles and other intermediate range missiles in West Germany. This was a new type, more powerful, more effective type of missile. And we felt, again, it was just raising the ante in the Cold War and being a provocative step to which the Soviet Union would respond with their own new missiles, and we'd be on this spiraling arms race. So there were, as you may remember, very large demonstrations in Western Europe, especially in West Germany, but in other countries that year. And so we talked about doing something in support of our sisters and brothers in Europe. And I think that's how the idea of the encirclement grew. But I know it was shortly after I joined the AFSC staff that we had invited as many peace groups as we knew of from around the state to meet on the Aurora campus one Saturday. And we had come up with several different possibilities, you know, like an all-day conference or a rally in Denver somewhere, or, you know, walking from Boulder to Rocky Flats, or the encirclement. And we got that idea from the women in England.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, the Greenham Commons was, I think, a U.S. air base, joint U.S.-British air base in England, where there were nuclear-armed airplanes stationed. And there may have also been nuclear missiles there, that I'm not sure of that. But I'm sure Pam or someone else would have a better memory of that. But it was the center of the British nuclear, a center of the British nuclear strike force. And these women had surrounded Greenham Commons for, I don't know, months and months, maybe longer than that, with some presence there. You know, wasn't always a large one, but they continued that as a protest against these. And so that gave us the idea of doing a similar encirclement of Rocky Flats.
Now, was the idea of that to have a nonviolent demonstration?
It was definitely nonviolent, yeah. And there would be, that it would not involve any law breaking or anything. We did talk, we had a lot of discussions with the people at Rocky Flats about it, and with local law enforcement officials and everyone, so that everyone knew what we were doing. Mm-hmm. And we asked them if people could, for as short a time as a minute, block the two gates, the major entrances on the east and the west side of the plant. And as I recall, they refused to do that. But as it turned out, I'm pretty sure that I was on the north site, where it was kind of the headquarters for organizing it. But I'm almost certain that people did, when we started the encirclement, some people did block those two gates. Now, there was no traffic coming in or out, so there was no confrontation over that.
That was like, it was a Saturday?
It was Saturday, October 15th, 1983. Beautiful sunny day, kind of like we're enjoying today. But we estimate that we had about 12,000 people. Estimates varied from 10 to 15,000, and maybe it was up to 15,000. We had figured simply by standing next to each other and stretching out arms that we would need about 1,000 people per mile. And the perimeter is roughly 17 miles. So there were spaces in the perimeter, especially those at, I think, the southeast corner, which was farthest from the gates. And I think we had two problems. One was we didn't have sufficient traffic direction. We had some. And then secondly, we had rented a shortwave radio communication system, which turned out not to be adequate. And I think we might have had fewer gaps because a lot of people wanted to be near the gates. And a lot of people crowded up at certain areas, so we weren't really at arm's length for an encirclement. And we might have been able to do it if we'd been able to spread people out. But, it was still a very impressive and awesome event.
Yes. Now, can you describe, that's a lot of people.
Yes.
Where did they come from? What
Well,
kinds of groups?
This was in a way the culmination of the nuclear weapons freeze campaign in Colorado. And I think it was that year that the Senate or the House voted some kind of resolution supporting the freeze, but it was a very watered down one. And I think the freeze campaign people felt that we'd kind of been co-opted by our supposed allies in Congress, because they knew they wouldn't get any real freeze through the Reagan administration, obviously. But anyway, so there had been, as you know, a lot of freeze campaign activity all through Colorado. I suppose Boulder and Denver were the centers of it, but Fort Collins, Greeley, Western Slope, many of them had at least a small group. So we advertised, we did a lot of publicity through all of this statewide network. And again, we had peace activists, environmentalists. We did a lot of outreach to the faith community, and it was especially Christian churches who responded, those on the more liberal side of the theological spectrum. A lot of, older people, parents, children. We did have a warning in our brochure that some of our scientist colleagues had suggested we put in, that we recommended that pregnant women and small children not be a part of that. And as I recall, we had some place, I don't know if a nearby church or school, where we invited them to come and be with us in spirit, but have some activities for the children. Because we believe that the plutonium emissions from the plant over the years did pose some danger to human health the closer you were there. And we felt, well, for adults can make a choice. If they want to go out there for an hour and to make a statement and to expose themselves a little more than they would if they stayed at their homes, most of us would see that as an acceptable risk. But we wanted to warn parents about children, or wanted to warn pregnant women, that in our judgment it would be better if they did not come. So.
And do you have a sense in terms of what drew maybe the majority of people there? Do you think it was kind of equal parts their worry about nuclear weapons globally, or environmental worries, specifically regarding this area, or can you?
It was certainly a mix of those, Dorothy. I don't know how to, quantify the numbers. I do know that later on, I mean, I think before the encirclement, before the big rallies, a lot of people were concerned because of the health and environmental issues. Not that they liked nuclear weapons, but that was the thing that got them involved in it, first of all. And then later, I'm sure they were aware of nuclear weapons, and that was not something they wanted. But it was the concern that for a good number of people, I think it was the health and environmental issues that brought them there. Because afterwards, when we'll talk about the plutonium burning issue in the mid-'80s.
Do you want to move to that?
Well, if we're ready to go on. So anyway, we think the encirclement was, a very powerful action. We had national and international media coverage. The evening news on all three of the local channels started off with the encirclement. So our publicity crew did a great job of, and we had people from, national news outlets there too, and I think a couple international ones. So
And as I recall, there weren't really arrests there. It was completely peaceful, nonviolent.
My memory is there were 1 or 2 arrests, but they were for traffic violations or something like that. But we were, I say we'd work with the state police and the local, I guess it was the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and Department of Energy. So we were all agreed on where we could park and where we could stand and that kind of thing, because we were outside of the fence, and the land on either side of the highway, as you know, that's a state highway, is state property. So as long as the state was happy or content with our being there, the Department of Energy couldn't keep us from standing on that state ground. So.
Do you have any reflections about that now, looking back on, having had a key role in that?
Yeah. Well, it was, I suppose it's one of probably the most memorable activity or project I've been involved in. And I want to stress there are a tremendous number of people who made this happen. I think there were probably about 40 on our steering committee, on our planning committee that met every 2 weeks. And we had like 5 or 6 different subgroups, media publicity, a group working on the logistics and so on and so forth. We rented porta potties naturally. We had people out there a long time, so we had to rent a lot of porta potties. And then representatives of each of those subcommittees would meet about once a week. And so we really kept in touch and made sure everyone was doing his or her assigned tasks. And then besides that planning committee of 40 or 50 maybe, there were many people like, you might have, if you were on the committee, you might have connected with the social concerns committee in your church or in your school, your professional association, and got a lot of those people working in energizing your particular church community or going to their neighborhood. We had still had a lot of audiovisual materials about the freeze, and we're giving a lot of talks and presentations in neighborhood groups and churches as a way of recruiting people for the encirclement. So it was really many, many people. I was a full-time staff person for AFSC, so I was able to be the coordinator and kind of make sure everyone did everything. But there were many people who worked just as hard as I did and as many hours, and most of them as volunteers, not as a paid staff person. So.
You might just say a few words about the freeze for people that maybe
okay.
Are young people that don't recollect what that was about.
All right. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, he came into office with a very aggressive administration as far as the Soviet Union went. He later dubbed them the evil empire, and actually a big nuclear arms buildup had begun in the last years of the Carter administration, which is unfortunate to say, but it had been. Well, the Reagan administration accelerated and increased that. So they moved it forward, and some of the people were, talking about, well, we might have to use nuclear weapons in Europe if the Soviet Union would ever attack. And it just seemed like the administration was a little more careless and reckless in their thinking about possibly using nuclear weapons. So a woman named Randall Forsberg, who had worked a number of years at a Peace Research Institute in Stockholm, worked out a proposal she called the nuclear weapons freeze. And it was a proposal that the Soviet Union and the U.S. would agree by treaty to freeze the level of their nuclear weapons. That is, not build any more nuclear weapons than they possessed at the time the treaty was signed. This would require very strict verification processes, so it wasn't just trusting the other side. That thing, well, you can't trust the Russians, was often thrown in our faces when we proposed this. We said, well, it's not trust. We have to let the Soviets come and explore our nuclear weapons complex very carefully and completely, and they have to do the same for us. So it's that kind of thing. So what the campaign tried to do was get support from the public, get support from city councils and county assemblies and state legislatures and Congress, and educate people, that kind of thing. And it was 1982, I think, when about 1 million or so people gathered in New York in support of this and in a call to the nations of the world to stop the nuclear arms buildup. So
should we move on now
Okay.
to your work with the burning, the incinerator?
Okay, and I'm sitting here trying to make sure in my memory. It was 1989 when the FBI raided the plant, but I think the incinerator issue came up about 1986 or 87.
That's what you said.
Okay.
In the previous.
All right. I think it was maybe in late 86 or early 87 that Rocky Flats announced that it was going to burn some materials, waste materials that were contaminated with slight levels of plutonium in a new type incinerator. And they were planning to do this without testing the incinerator. Well, when people found out about it, that caused great consternation, especially in people in Arvada and Wheat Ridge, Broomfield, Westminster, in those areas closest to the plant. And Jan Pilcher was a long-time Rocky Flats activist, was very instrumental in organizing people to rise up against this. And so there were town meetings held, there were educational programs, educational materials put together. We gathered, I think, about 20,000 signatures on a petition to Governor Romer to do what he could to halt it. And a number of the groups brought a lawsuit alleging that the DOE had to do an environmental impact statement before they could use this incinerator. Well, finally there was a settlement out of court that I think they were required to do a lesser environmental study, but that they would have to do some kind of testing. And as a matter of fact, when they did 1 or 2 tests without any plutonium material in there, at least one of the times a fire did break out and escape from the incinerator part itself and got into the outer containment area. So, and I'm not aware they ever used that then in the future. It just seemed to become a kind of non-issue after that snafu with the test runs. But that did energize a lot of people, and it wasn't because of nuclear weapons, which they were still producing there.
Do you think that that drew in some different kinds of people?
I think definitely it did, yes. People who'd probably never go to an anti-nuclear weapons protest, but who, you know, this was something right on their front yards with the threat of the plutonium coming over. And of course they claimed, the DOE claimed, well, we've got it set up so there's no way any plutonium particles could escape from the plant. But people had heard that too often before, and plutonium had escaped into the surrounding territory. So more and more people were just getting skeptical of the plant. Yeah.
Now, some people say that it was the media covering this, that, you know, that the media went overboard in covering this, and that frightened people.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't remember, honestly, Dorothy. I'd have to go back and look at the media. But my sense is they were generally pretty even-handed in, you know, giving a opportunity for both opponents of the plant, people who feared the contamination, and the plant to explain its side of the story, and to, you know, be able to argue that it was indeed safe. And I think trying to think if it was at that point that no, I guess it was after the FBI raid that the state of Colorado was given more authority to monitor things there. Because I think up to this, you know, still at this point of the plutonium struggle, incinerator struggle in '86, the Colorado Department of Health and the EPA both had very limited authority over what was going on at the plant.
But that changed after the FBI raid.
I believe after the FBI raid, that was the thing that Governor Roy Romer was very assertive and, you know, threatened to do everything he could to close it down or something if the state health department wasn't given a bigger role in monitoring what was going on at the plant. So.
Now, I think that you and other people involved in planning protests had some connection with some of the workers through the union.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right. In the early years when Dick Lamm was elected governor in the fall of '72, and Tim Wirth was elected the congressperson from the 2nd District, which included Rocky Flats. This was 1974, excuse me. They were elected that year. That was the Watergate election year. And with prodding from some of the Rocky Flats activists, they set up a Lamm-Wirth Task Force to try to find out what they could about environmental and health issues at Rocky Flats and make recommendations then to the governor and Congressman Wirth. And that included medical people, scientific people, health department people, peace activists, and union representatives. Particularly, at that time was Pat and Jim Kelly, who'd been longtime officers in the union and worked there, I think, since the beginning. And so people met around that forum and were able to come to some consensus on some issues about the plant, environmental and health, but obviously not on closing the plant or moving it. And so out of that came an ongoing Rocky Flats Monitoring Committee, which included a cross-section of the same people who were on the task force. And for a while, there were meetings between the peace and environmental activists and the union people. But again, at a meeting or a couple of meetings, I was not involved in those. I wasn't on the FCC staff then. And I hope Pam and Judy can fill you in on this better. Some conflict arose, some serious problem, and that ended up with very little communication 4 years between the two sides, I think, which is unfortunate because I think, you know, we did agree on some common things. We were supporting worker health and safety, and we were supporting economic conversion in the sense of the government assuring them of jobs if they ever did stop nuclear weapons production there. And an interesting thing, about the time of the plutonium incinerator issue, but from then on and then with the FBI raid, there were a lot of public hearings in which people were given more information about the plant and able to give input. And I remember some of us meeting with Jim Kelly, talking with him, and we had some very good conversations. We did meet with other union people after the FBI raid or after the plant, I guess they decided to close it down, and we offered to work with them and wanted to work with them in pushing for things like, you know, adequate continued medical insurance for these people and equivalent jobs in other industry, that kind of thing. But the union leaders at that point were not that keen on working with us. But an interesting thing, going back to Jim Kelly, who was a great person and a real character, I think it was in the 90s that I was at a meeting with him, several other people, and we were just, somebody brought us together to try and say, okay, let's talk in an informal setting. Maybe we can put aside our arguments and all of that. And Jim said, you know, when you people were out at the gates, you were really helping us inside because we really had to fight hard for worker protection. And he said, we tried to do it through working with our Congress people. But he said, I'd have to admit that your being out there did enable us to put a little more pressure on it. Now, he could never have said that publicly during that time. But you know, he was, I think, a very special person in many ways. And I mean, he fought hard. He believed that making the weapons was a good thing. But when he and other union officers, union people said, well, we wouldn't work here if it weren't safe, I really think that was a lot of denial on their part, because they knew how unsafe some of the things were, and they were fighting internally, but quietly, because if they'd come out with the public media, well, that would be threatening their jobs, you know. So it's understandable why they, you know, would try to make changes the way they did. But I just can't believe that most of them really believed it was a safe work environment, you know.
Did you want to say something about later plans for, after Rocky Flats was in fact closed down,
Yeah.
and went into cleanup mode? Did you want to say something about what happened to the work that was being done manufacturing the pits of nuclear weapons?
Well, that work simply halted. You see, it really ended, as you know, at the end of 1989, they basically shut down plutonium operations because one of the key buildings was in such terrible shape it needed a lot of repairs, you know, a lot of upgrading and repair, which would be a long and expensive process. Well, about every 3 or 6 months they'd say, well, we'll be up and running in another 3 to 6 months. And then deadline would come and nothing would happen. Well, in his last State of the Union message in January of what turned out to be his last one, in January of 1992, the first President Bush said very little about military issues, but he did say that we have decided to cancel plans to make any additional warheads for the W-88, or the W-88 warheads for the Trident missiles on submarines. Well, that was the only remaining warhead that was in the pipeline for production of pits at Rocky Flats. So that was ultimately the end of Rocky Flats, because by then it was clear that the facility was in such bad shape, it would just take so much to get it going again. And then it was officially the next year, in the first year of the Clinton administration, that the Department of Energy announced that Rocky Flats was no longer a weapons production facility, but was now a cleanup site.
How did you feel about that?
Well, very excited, obviously, that you know, finally this had ended. And obviously the winding down of the Cold War was a major part of that. I'm not by any means claiming that the peace movement and environmental movement closed Rocky Flats all by herself. Had the Cold War not ended, I think the government would have worked mightily to try to get production going again. But at least I think we helped the public in general see that it was a very dangerous place for the workers and the community. And so had that support, growing support, for just never doing any more nuclear weapons work there. So.
Have you felt discouraged by the fact that the nuclear arms race and the production of nuclear weapons has not ended?
It is discouraging, Dorothy, especially with the present administration's plans that they would like to build a new Rocky Flats somewhere else that could turn out as many as 450 plutonium triggers a year. They would like to design these mini nukes, that is less than 5 kilotons, which they're saying, well, you could use in a very controlled way and not cause a lot of, quote, collateral damage. They've been talking about this nuclear bunker buster, gravity bomb dropped from an airplane that could penetrate the Earth, say to get to an underground missile or an underground communication site and then explode. They want to get money to speed up the reopening of the test site in Nevada in case they want to test new warheads. So it's kind of just sounds like they're trying to start it all over. The House and the Senate have not agreed on this. In fact, the House, the last I'd heard, in one of their committees, had cut out appropriations for the coming fiscal year for these new weapons programs I've talked about. But what will happen when they finally, the two houses get together and have conference committee, the money could well go back in. It's just research and development money now, but we all know how once they start throwing money into something, then, well, we've put a lot of money into it, so we can't waste it. We've got to go forward with the program, you know. So it is discouraging, and I think we have a very militarized society, and that it's very hard for any candidate. I mean, Ralph Nader could challenge it, you know, some other Green could candidate, an independent could challenge it, but even for a liberal Democrat, and I'm not suggesting that Mr. Kerry is that or whether he is or isn't, for a very liberal Democrat to challenge the militarization of our society and to suggest a significant cutback in defense spending, which could be done without any threat to our security, that would just be political suicide. Now, I hope some people will do that who have more of a public voice than I do. But I think that's the point we're at. That's so much a part of us, and it's just accepted without question that we need this $400, $500 billion a year for military things, that it is discouraging. I guess my hope is, as I probably said before, that in past history, you think of the abolition of slavery and the granting of women equal political rights and legal rights, which they still don't have everywhere in the world, or not even in the United States sometimes. But those were long, long struggles. So I think it's important that some of us at least keep the struggle up and keep speaking our words and trying to gradually spread that word among the public. And if enough of that happens, then there will be change at the top.
That might be a good place to stop.
Okay, great.
Do you have anything?
No, that's fine. I'm very happy with it, if you are.
Okay.